I'm a retired mariner. I've spent almost half a century working at sea before I retired in 2016. I grew up and worked on my first ships out of Victoria, BC before moving to Nova Scotia in the early 70s to go to school. I fell in love with the province and I stayed there for nearly a decade. And after watching the Bluenose II sailing in and out of the harbor for a couple of years, I got up the nerve to walk down there one day to get a job, never thinking for a moment they'd hire a Westerner, but they did. And it ended up being a really important part of my sea career. I ended up back in the West Coast, and for the past 25 years before I retired, I was a senior master with British Columbia Ferries. And that's kind of my story, I guess. Well, I wrote a couple of books too.
Yes, you wrote a couple of books. We'll get to those. They certainly formed an important part of my life as we went. So I guess we'll start is, how did you first come in contact with the Bluenose? What was your first knowledge of the Bluenose?
Oh, that's kind of an interesting story. I kind of grew up with the Bluenose, almost literally. My grandfather had a really beautiful model of the Bluenose over his mantelpiece in his house in Victoria. And it just loomed very, very large in my life. It was very tall. It was taller than I was as a toddler. And he was actually given that model by Captain Angus Walters in 1935 as a retirement gift. And I eventually inherited it. And it's become like a treasured possession. I didn't want to drag it into this room because it's still pretty fragile, but it's still unrestored. The sails on it were just fell to pieces in my hands after a few years, because my grandmother, who couldn't stand watching these sails turn sort of a darkish sort of tea-like color, would polish them with white shoe polish, right? And that did a big number on those things, and they fell apart after a while.
You're a lucky man. You're lucky to have that model.
I can tell you a kind of funny story about 1974 and 1975. 1975 is when I joined the Bluenose II. But in 1974, I was sitting in the backyard of my parents' house in Victoria, and I had that model of the Bluenose in front of me, and I was starting to do a bit of restoration work on it. And I had the main boom, it was about this big, in my hands, and I was sanding it down and everything. The following year, I was sitting in Dartmouth Shipyard, straddling that 81-foot boom of the Bluenose II, and talk about déjà vu, scraping it down, right? It was pretty serendipitous, I guess you'd say. So at the old Olin's wharf, when she was owned by Olin, she'd been transferred over to the Nova Scotia government, but she was still berthed at Olin's warehouse. And that was quite the spot, right? It was a real working wharf. And I walked down there, and it was all lonely by itself. And I went down, and the mate came out. It was a man named Freddie Copas. And I asked him if it was possible to get a job on there. And I didn't think for a hope, at Westerner, he wouldn't hire me. And he took my discharge book, which is a seaman's resume, basically, of all the ships he's worked on. And I'd worked on a few beforehand. And he looked at it, and he said, well, one point in your favor. He says, you come from my hometown, Victoria. And I was like, what? So I must have liked the cut of my jib, as they say. And he said, yes, if you can climb up there to the spreaders, 100 feet up to the mast, the mast top, you got a job. And heart in mouth, I climbed up there and I got the job. And the rest, they say, is history. When I went to Nova Scotia College of Art and Design, it was to study photography. And that I made a deal with one of my professors to take a lot of photographs on the Bluenose II when I was there. So and I got credit for it. And so that was way too much fun to turn down. So I said, sure. And so I took a lot of shots on the Bluenose. I mean, a lot. And I just had a great time. So it was an amazing experience, and I got a lot of incredible images out of the deal. When I decided to tell the story, I wanted to tell it as fair as possible from both sides of the border. And to that end, I already had a lot of Canadian research, but I needed more. So I spent a lot of time back east in Nova Scotia, of course, to finish off that side. But I also went down to Massachusetts, Gloucester and Boston in particular. And there I met a lot of very eager people in the archives there that were very willing to help me out, fill in the gaps of what happened from the American point of view. And it was wonderful. My wife and I went down and we spent weeks sitting in archives, burning out microfilm machines, just gathering as much material as I could. And there was a lot. It was insane how much there was. At the time, the coverage, in the 1920s and 30s when the races went on, the coverage was huge. It was a very, very big deal. And they used their best writers and photographers to do reportage on these events. So there was a lot of information to cover. And it worked really well because sometimes you have to say unflattering things about one side or the other. And it's very useful if you can find the quote you need to reinforce that unflattering idea from their side of the border instead of the opposite, so it doesn't sound like sour cream. So it worked out really well. That was really good.
You're being shy about telling us the name of the book, so could you tell us what the name of the book is?
Want me to show you?
And I mean, I certainly know the story of where it came from, but could you share with us where the name came from? How did you come up with the name?
Okay, it came up from, and some people didn't believe this. They thought it was kind of a phony title and stuff, but it's not. It was the person that set up the idea for the races in the first place was William Dennis from the Halifax Herald. And he wanted to put up a trophy that was for East Coast fishermen, guys that lived out at sea, knew how to work the weather and they wouldn't be intimidated by it. So he called it a race for real sailors. And that just rang a bell so true with me. It had to be the title. So that's what I came up with, a race for real sailors. And it was pretty important.
So you went to Cape Ann Historical Society, you went to the newspapers. I read the other day that actually I think Captain Angus lent MIT a copy of the plans of the ship, and they still have a copy of the plans for the ship in their library.
Is that right? That's the first I've heard of that, actually.
Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Was there another source that you found that of sort of memorabilia or stories that you've
there was intriguing to you? There was tons of places. There was I went everywhere I could in the budget. I had a budget, so I had to limit where I went there. But places like Mystic Seaport, the Boston Public Library was a great source of material in their special collections. They had photographically wise, they had a collection by this photographer named Leslie Jones. One of the curators of that collection sat down and went through his entire, because he was a photographer for the Herald down there, and he took that collection and went through and picked out every one that had anything to do with the International Fisherman's Cup races. And there must have been, 200 or 300 images. They're all online now. You can find most of them, but and they were wonderful. They're these little 4x5 glass plates. I also interviewed Joe Garland, who was like one of the preeminent historians there, written lots of books on stuff. I met him several times, spent lots of time sitting in his house called Black Bess, which overlooks Gloucester Harbor, and you can dream about schooners going by back and forth in front of you. And he was a wonderful guy, and he was also a reporter for Associated Press, as well as a nonfiction writer. And he knew Leslie Jones, and he said he was this weird little guy that went around with this big long coat that went almost to the ground, and whether summer or winter, and had big deep pockets, and they were full of these glass plates and sleeves that he could use in his camera. So he was a pretty interesting guy too. But the Essex Shipbuilding Museum, I met Dana Harvey.
Story. Dana Story.
Dana's Story. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, my memory's slipping a little bit here. And he was just a great guy. I was people just brought me in and wanted to tell me stuff. And I think people that work in museums and archives and stuff are just a wonderful, wonderful group of people. And they're so welcoming and just wanting to give you stuff. And the same in Canada, of course. That was probably one of the beauties of doing this book, is just meeting so many neat and wonderful people. And I still hear from people. I got an email like 3 weeks ago from a guy, a historian for the Essex Shipbuilding Museum, to say he found a mistake in my book and wanted to tell me about it. Yeah, I spelled Marty Walsh's name wrong. It's a C instead of an S, right? But it's the connections you make that make it wonderful too. So, and I was a little nervous when I wrote it, the reception I would get in Nova Scotia, because, you know, it kind of has warts and all in it, and how it would be received, you know. But the story is so rich, the character's so strong. Nothing's going to take away from it. It still stands. It's never going to go away. And it just made the story even richer and more powerful, telling the whole story from beginning to end. And finding new images and stuff to throw into it too was really a godsend. That was pretty nice too.
Yeah.
So
I don't think I really understood the passion that your own personal passion that you brought to the book until you came to ship to do the book release. And I was in the chat room and I was looking out the porthole, and I know you're coming, and I am super excited to meet you. This is a huge thing for me. And you're on the wharf jumping up and down like a little kid because you're next to the ship. And it just, I will die with that image burned in my brain, because it is so wonderful to have a guy with that much passion and to bring it in the book, but also to bring it into your personal life. It was just, I will never forget that. So,
well, that was so much fun. And thank you so much for being there for me at that time. It was a pretty special time. And I will admit, I'm a number one grade A class one groupie, Bluenose groupie. So
perfect. All right, we're going to get into some meat and the bones of it, and maybe some of your take on it. So, how did the International Fisherman's Cup come to be?
Right. Well, it began. The Fisherman's Cup began as a reaction to a final race of an America's Cup yachting series in 1920. The competitors it was Shamrock 4 and Resolute were like the boats are today. They were just finely tuned race machines, just built for speed. And the wind was too strong, and they feared damaging their vessels for that day. So tails between their legs, they went up behind Sandy Hook and dropped the hook and waited for another day. Well, this caused like an immense amount of ridicule and derision with the public and the press, especially. I mean, I think one newspaper called it, they would have had a better race with paper napkin boats in a bathtub or something. And William Dennis, he suggested a better race, like we talked about before. It would be one between the two largest fishing schooner communities on the coast, Gloucester, Massachusetts, and Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. They called it the Race for Real Sailors. That's how he promoted it. And they had a contest set up in the fall of the same year. The Yankees ended up sending up a schooner called Esperanto with Captain Marty Walsh. And the Canadians entered Delawana with Captain Tommy Himmelman. Unfortunately for us, the Americans won the first two races and took the cup home to the U.S. And boy, that must have really hurt. But that was the start of the International Fisherman's Cup Series, and it would be held on and off for almost the next 2 decades.
All right, so here we are. We're sitting in Nova Scotia. We've put up the prize money. Senator Dennis has put up the prize money. We put up the trophy, and we lost. And we principally lost as opposed to, there were a large number of Nova Scotians and East Coasters living in Gloucester at the times. But we lost. So what was the response? Did we tuck our tails between our legs, or?
Well, the response, as the story goes, within, I think it was 10 minutes of the Esperanto crossing the finish line ahead of Delawana, funds were committed for building a new, faster schooner.
So it took us 10 minutes.
Yeah, I think that's all it took. They weren't going to take this line down, right? So, I mean, it's kind of ironic because the Gloucestermen had kind of long considered Canadian schooners as lumbering cargo carriers, and in a way they weren't too far wrong, because we had two pretty much different types of fisheries. The Nova Scotian fishery was a salt fishery, which meant you went up, you went out, you caught fish, caught cod, split it and flaked it and put it in piles of salt, and that could sit forever. And they just stay out there until they filled their holds and came back in, right? So the bigger the hold, the better, right? So they were bigger ships. Where the Americans were primarily a fresh fish industry where they used ice. They'd go out, they'd catch fish and throw them on ice, gut them and stuff, and throw them on ice, and then get back to port. So they were fast and smaller, because fast turnaround times meant, first to market, you got better prices and everything. So that was pretty important. But they still had to conform to the race rules, which meant you had to be a fisherman first and carry capacity loads. And so Nova Scotians, they hired, it was unusual. They didn't go to a name brand designer of boats. They went to a young, relatively inexperienced boat designer named William Ruy. He was chosen to design this new craft. And he did a pretty fine job. And the Bluenose was born and launched the next year on March 26, 1921, well in good time to get out to the season as the rules required to put in a season on the banks fishing. And the Bluenose, that designed Bluenose, the end product ended up dominating the races till 1938.
So do you think I guess it's always an advantage to design after the rules have been laid down? So
yeah,
William knew what the rules were.
Yeah. And the rules, that became an issue throughout the race series too, because in almost every race from there on in, there was new rules changed. It was tweaked and stuff. And as it became more popular, more money and power brokers would come in and want to make it more like yachting rules and stuff. And that would not always sit well with the competitors. So that became difficult as the years went on.
So we've launched the Bluenose. She's gone fishing. 1921. Here we go. What's the race?
Here we go.
A legend is about to be born.
What's that?
A legend is about to be born. The country sits
a legend
holding its
is
breath.
Indeed about to be born. Well, so the 1921 series, they held a series of elimination races in Canada that included the Delawana and a new ship, and another boat called the Canada, I believe it was, that was built for the same reasons. So, I mean, Bluenose wasn't the only one on the block, but the Bluenose was the one that turned out to be the best. So they had an elimination race, and Bluenose, Captain Walters, Captain Angus Walters of the Bluenose, he won the race hands down to be the challenger of the next series. And the next series ended up still being in Halifax. So the Americans, they held an elimination race too, but unfortunately without the Esperanto, because the Esperanto ran aground earlier that year on a fishing trip and was totally lost. I think all their crew were all survived, but the boat was lost, so they didn't have Delawana. And they had a series of elimination races in Gloucester, which ended up with a smaller vessel called Elsie, a very sweet looking, fast boat, but it was much smaller than the Bluenose's design. She won the right to defend the title, and she sailed up to Canada with the same skipper, Marty Walsh, at the helm. And she was fast. She was a very quick vessel, even though she was smaller. And on sailing terms, waterline length usually means all. But when she took off at the start line on these things, the Haligonians had that like all gone feeling because she just streaked ahead. And it took, I can't remember exactly which buoy it was before the Bluenose caught up. But when they started turning to windward, the Bluenose just started walking away from her because that was Bluenose's best point of sail by far, and she just took it, and she took that race handily. In the second race, I believe it was second. I might have these ones mixed up, but it was the same thing again. She just made a big sprint at the beginning. They were neck and neck for the longest way, but the sea started rising, and it was quite a bit of wind, quite a gale blowing, and the Bluenose had passed the Elsie on one of the legs towards home, and the Elsie, Marty Walsh just couldn't stand seeing the Bluenose taken away from her, so he put more sail up. I think he put his foretop up in a ballooner or jib topsail, and I think they said if more sail alone could have won the race, he would have done it. But nature does as nature will, and it took out his foretopmast, and there's a lovely shot of the Elsie diving into the sea with her topmast gone, and you can sort of see what sort of rollicking sea it is, and the crew had to crawl out into that bowsprit while being pushed in under about 5-6 feet of water at each dive to try and haul in the wreckage of the sail and everything and get it on. But I think within 6 minutes they had her all sewn up, and under shortened sail again she was actually doing better, and Walters lowered what sail he had to make them equal in the spirit of sportsmanship, and but he was way ahead and took that race. The 1922 series was probably the most contentious series. Just a lot of stuff happened, and a lot of it was because of new rules added to things. But it really showed the difference between the Bluenose capabilities and the Americans' capabilities, and the schooner that they chose for that race, which was the schooner Henry Ford. The Bluenose could stand up to weather a lot better than most boats. That was one of her marking features. Whereas in the same weather, the schooner Henry Ford would be burying her decks and stuff, where the guys on the Bluenose would be walking around in their street shoes almost with no water on them. And but right from the start, it was contentious. They started on the first race, and they weren't sure they were going to start it again. They started because there was light winds, and they sort of canceled, then went on. And they weren't going to do it. And Clayton Morrissey, who was the master of the Henry Ford, yelled across to Walters while they were on the water, and I said, "Let's just race anyways. To hell with these guys." So they took off and they raced, and it was a fair and square race, but it wasn't really timed because they just took off on their own, and the chase boat or the boat that was going around, the committee boat, couldn't keep up with them. So they ended up rounding all the buoys, coming to the end there, and nobody had really timed it. So they disqualified them as it being a false start, I guess they called it. Yeah. So, and that just outraged everybody. And Walters was okay with it at the time. He said, well, it was fair and square and everything. I'm fine with it. But I don't think he was so fine when they had a race the following day, a second one, and there was again light airs, but they raced it, and the Henry Ford won the second day. So that would have made them win the series had they allowed the first race. So everybody went into an absolute uproar on the American side. And not only that, they were into sail measuring at the beginning, and they were making the Americans cut off some of their sail. And that was quite a bit of a bother. So the Americans actually mutinied and said, we're not sailing anymore. This race is ours, right? And they walked off, and it took a lot of power brokers in town to turn the thing around, including his wife even got into Captain Morrissey's wife even got in on the deal and everything. And it was, and the upshot was they were going to race again the next day. So they had high winds come up the next day. and the Bluenose just took off. It was a good race, but the Henry Ford just couldn't keep up with her on windward work, and she just took off and won that race. And then the following day was another windy day, and there was marches in the streets with his crews. His crew was really pissed off. They were not having it. They were mutinying. You should see the headlines at the time, right? It tells the whole story in like 3 words, right? It was pretty good. But on the fourth and final race, it was windy, and Bluenose got out there, and they were just charging along, and the weather was picking up, getting stronger and stronger. And while the Bluenose was standing up to the weather without hardly getting her decks dry, the Henry Ford's deck was absolutely buried. And there's an incredible picture taken by this eminent marine photographer named Morris Rosenfeld, whose photos are in the collection at Mystic Seaport. He had his large format camera, and he was sitting on the aft coach house roof looking forward when he took this shot. And it's like almost like a 45-degree angle, and the ratlins on the stays at the side there are just buried. It's like a torrent river running down half the deck. The rest on the high side are all these crews sort of nonchalantly sitting on the rail with their arms over the rail and everything. Even the cook is sitting, you can see him in the distance, sitting in the center hatch, sort of looking out, right, watching this river just going by him. And when shortly after that picture was taken, the foremast goes. It just parts, snapped, comes down. And the story goes with Rosenfeld that as the ship was leaning over more, and he had all his equipment beside him. It was either take the picture or watch all his gear slide off into the scuppers. Well, he took the picture, and I think that was probably the best thing he could have done, because it's such a great picture. So, and in the end, the Bluenose won, and there was such an uproar after that. So they just figured it was 2 each. They wanted another race and stuff, but that didn't happen, and it was over until the next year.
Right on. Yeah, I've sailed the Bluenose once or twice rail down, and it is an absolute terrifying experience.
It's crazy because
it's just insanity.
And it's absolutely crazy because, as any yachtsman knows, the once you start burying your deck, you're adding drag, and you're slowing yourself down. Yes. So you want to keep that, just on the
deck edge immersion.
Of the hull there.
Yes.
Yeah. Deck edge immersion. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. The forces on those boats are just incredible. And when I see, buried to the main mast with water halfway up the deck and someone casually hanging on the windward side looking at this happen, it just floors me.
The other interesting thing about that picture was it was probably my gateway into wanting to do more research, because a friend of mine, Richie LeBlanc, had that picture blown up inside his cabin down the French shore. And I just fell in love with it. I'd never seen anything like that before. And it quite excited me that there was more out there than I had known. I'd never seen it in any Canadian publications. So I wanted to do that. And that's one of the things that was ticking over in my brain when I wanted to rewrite the story, is find more images. And some of the images that were published before were not in the right context too. So I wanted to straighten all that area out too. So, but that was a very important picture to me. There's another one by Frederick Wallace, who was he started Canadian Fisherman magazine. He was a journalist that just loved the fishing industry and schooner fishing in particular. And he went out so often with these guys. They allowed him to sail the ships. He took out schooners with crews. And then he'd jump into his suit and jump on a train and go back to Ottawa and publish stuff. And he took a lot of pictures that are just stellar. And one of those is I call it the Widowmaker. And it's the bowsprit with 3 guys out on it. And they're bagging in sails. They're in wet skins, which are, oiled canvas, right? And, heavy leather sea boots and sou'westers pulled down. and it's windy and they're out there. If you slip from one of those foot ropes and went down, you're not coming up again because you're not wearing a life jacket and you got woolen clothes underneath it. You're going to go down. It's a dangerous job. Yeah. And that's another one. Do you want to know more?
Yeah. I just, when you're talking about the schooners, I think Frederick William Wallace has a special place in there.
Man,
the roving fisherman, and yeah. I'm still waiting for someone to take on Blue Water and turn it into a movie. That's my sort of dream.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
yeah. Yeah.
So Bluenose is 121. She's 122. What makes her so fast?
Oh, that's a good question. It's a combination of probably one of the sweetest hulls you'll ever see. Like it's even looking at it nowadays in 2021, it looks like a fast hull. If you look at a half model of her, it's a very sweet hull, and it's a combination of that and a captain who is absolutely tenacious and aggressive skipper. Put those two together, and you got a racing combination. But her hull had a very long entry and very slippery looking, going right down the hull to the end as it washes away. But she had a very full beam on her too, so she was very capable of standing up to lots of wind. And to conform to the rules, it gave her lots of body and area inside for great cargo capacity. Because Walters, he was a highliner; he carried lots of fish. So it was a brilliant vessel all around. It wasn't just a one-off that he got the highliner of the year sort of fish catch. It was I can't remember how many it was, but he was consistently one of the top earners. He was a pretty impressive character, fishing and sailing. I can tell you for sure that the debate and passion is still very much alive in Gloucester about what happened in these races. It's, as you probably know from going down
yes,
there.
I do.
All you got to go down. All you got to do is go down and talk to just about any sailor, and you're going to get an earful. It was something I found when I went down to do my research, and anytime you bring the subject up, there was a debate on. People still care. Americans naturally thought they were robbed. They thought they could have won. Perhaps they should have won in times. I don't know, but they. But the prize is forever out of their reach, and it's going to stand forever, and there's nothing they can do about it, right? And I'm sure you. Sailing the Bluenose II, get the odd request for a match race.
Yeah, just about.
Yeah, but it's kind of deep. It's deeper than that in a way, because it's almost like it could be almost sibling rivalry in a way, because the communities are so hugely connected together. There was there's family ties, through Nova Scotians that moved through the centuries down there for a better living, right? So there's lots of family connections that are hooked up with there. There's also a big connection over loss. Fishermen that had died at sea. There's a memorial in Gloucester. It's a beautiful memorial of the man at the wheel, and there's some tablets in front of it that have 5,000 names on it, and that's from 300 years of fishing. And of those 5,000 names, there's 1,200 Nova Scotians in that. So there's a real big tie down there between the two communities, and that's probably what makes the rivalry even stronger. So
yes, and there's the lovely church with the statue of Mary holding the schooner.
That's actually sitting in the Cape Ann Museum right now, or unless they've moved it, but that is absolutely beautiful. Well, during the races, it couldn't have been bigger. It was it was a different time. It was in the middle of the Depression. It was also in the middle of great technological change too, because radios were becoming more popular. There was broadcasting. It was some of the first broadcast sport nationally. So you could just about go. I've looked at newspapers in Victoria, Lethbridge, Grand Falls, Minnesota. There's like everywhere in Canada and the United States. It made headline news back in the day. And the headlines like the last race was in 1938, and it shared front page above the fold headlines alongside ominous news from Nazi Germany. They were like side by side, and I mean that tells it all. It was very important at the time. Sporting events like that were incredible, but it really touched the core of a lot of people, and they just loved it. They couldn't get enough of it. And for all the little bit of infighting and rule changing and all that sort of stuff, the public never saw any of that for the most part. They just wanted to see, these guys doing what they did and did it so well. It was the end of an era too, which made it even more important. And I think a lot of people can feel that.
Is that what stopped the races? Was that the age of sail and the impending war? They just couldn't do it anymore?
Oh, by the time the last race was done, the schooners were obsolete. I mean, even during the first races, in 1920, motorized vessels were starting to take over. It took a lot longer in Nova Scotia than it did in the States, but it was coming. I mean, the drumbeat of time was marching along, and they were obsolescent by the time the first races were started. There's still a lot of schooners out there, and they were all fishing, but their time had come. And by 1938, the Bluenose raced against the Gertrude L. Thibault, and Thibault was built 10 years earlier, but the Bluenose was 17 years old at the time. And by the time a schooner in that era was 10 years old, they were thinking about trading her in for the newer car, and
yes,
they'd be shipped off to the West Indian trade, and they'd be gone. So she was 17 years old. She was really showing her age. She was hogged, which meant she was sagging at both ends. So her waterline was actually longer than it should have been, and that caused a big problem during those races too, because there was a lot of ballast shifting going on and stuff during that. But she wouldn't, it had to come to an end. That was it. Yeah, for sure.
I was talking with someone today, and we were discussing Captain Angus himself. And you're looking at, this started out as a fisherman, hard driver, dory fisherman, hard life. I mean, he had a hard life, and he takes his ship and his crew and wins races. He's starting to be on the front page of newspapers. He's starting to represent now Nova Scotia, now the East Coast, now the country. This fisherman takes the boat to Chicago to represent. He goes to meet the king. Like,
across the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah. What was this for this guy, this fisherman from Lunenburg, that all of a sudden is representing the country?
No kidding. Yeah. I mean, and he was a real character, right? And the funny thing is how he was thought. Basically, what you thought of him depended on what side of the border you lived on, pretty much. I mean, Canadians kind of, he wasn't exactly a really endearing sort of fellow, but he was first and foremost a fisherman, and he was a really, really adept sailor. Nova Scotians, the people that worked with him knew he had an abrasive side and a really caustic tongue if you got in the way of something he wanted done. But man, that guy could catch fish. And like you said before, he kept his crew safe. He never lost a man. So he never had a problem having a crew, right? So, he was gold as far as they were concerned. But south of the border, it was a bit of a different story because whenever he was racing, he was never shy of needling his opponents like nobody's business. And they could see him as overly aggressive, or some thought he was unsportsmanlike, maybe overbearing and stuff. But they even had to admit that he was an absolutely stellar sailor, right? He was the best. And for us, he won races, and who's going to argue with that?
Yeah.
So,
And that led to the dime, that led to the stamp, that led to the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame. That's
right.
What a legacy! Yeah. What a legacy for a fisherman from Lunenburg to leave behind for all of us.
No kidding. Yeah.
So I guess the closing question is to try and sum it all up. And why did the Bluenose capture our attention, and why is it still today? When I take the ship to Green Bay, do they drive for 2 hours because they only want to see that ship? It's an incredible thing.
Yeah. Well, to start with, it's really hard to overstate the importance of the Bluenose and what she represented to Canada. Her successes really are woven into the fabric of our national identity. Like I think you said it before too, we were a really young nation back then. Like we were barely 50 years old, and we had a lot to prove to the world and our place in it. Like I said, everywhere you went in the States or Canada, you could read about it in newspapers. It was just huge stuff there. You just can't say how big. It was a really, really big deal. So there was great national pride, right, in it. So secondly, it's like you're saying, it's like everybody likes big sailing ships, and this one is ours. And it's got such a great history, right? And it's really to see it in the faces of people whenever you pull into a port. I remember it in 1975 and 76 when I was on the Bluenose II. People are just ecstatic. They just wanted to reach out and touch her, board her, see her, and it still happens to this day. So there's something there, but I think it represents a part of our past where we were really, really strong. The prosperity grew from shipbuilding and seafaring, and she just has a really long-lasting legacy that's really important, and it shows us kind of the way into the future too, as far as I'm concerned. I think she's really important.
Awesome. And you're going to relaunch your book. You're going to take the Race for Real Sailors and dust it off, and there she is. Yes. I think that's just an incredible thing. Your book is certainly definitive in telling the racing story from a neutral point of view, and not just glossing over the top, but delving deep into the story. And do you have closing comments or a story you'd like to share with us? Or
when I worked on the Bluenose II, it was big for me, and I think every young kid would have do nothing better for them to get onto the board of a big sailing ship and work for a period, because it teaches you so much more than most ships I've worked on. Just all the old time seamanship that you do on there, and you do everything, just never goes out of style. It teaches you teamwork, how to live with people. Far more so because of the cramped quarters and everything on it. And it's just, it's such an exhilarating experience to have gone through that and have that sort of as a foundation in my sea career. So there you go.
Thank you. I would quite happily sit here for hours and hours and hours and trade yarns with you. And you need to come out this way and come for sail with us in the near future.
Well, if it clears up in the fall, and we get some windows of opportunity or something, you might see us out as early as that, but I can't see it for the foreseeable future, unfortunately. Much as I'd love to, it's been far too long. Yeah.